microplastics, and I kind of did a little note on that, a little document on that, kind of describe what my thoughts on it are. So let's go ahead and share my screen here and open everything up. Okay, so right here. Okay, so microplastics, right? What exactly are microplastics? Before we get into it, let's just talk about a little bit of background behind plastic use throughout the world, right? So I guess what we could call the last 17 years, actually what a lot of historians and a lot of scientists are referring to, is they're referring to this particular time epoch as the Plasticine, right? So in the last 70 years, there's been a tremendous growth in plastic production and use in a variety of different materials. And again, plastics are just, polymers, just these very complex molecules consist of multiple different smaller repeating subunits of carbon, hydrogen, and then oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, chlorine, and fluorine additives to strengthen them and either add certain characteristics to make them ultra strong, or perhaps to make them more flexible. And you can see this used in a variety of industries. And as I mentioned, they're used as shapes, films, coating, sealants. They're ubiquitous. They're all over the place. The most common ones are polypropylene and polyethylene, with the idea that, again, from an industry standpoint, these seem to be pretty useful products, right? They have a very high melting point. They don't react with water. They're resistant to cracking, and they can be made flexible too. And so and they're fairly inexpensive relatively to other materials. So the use has just exploded tremendously. Here's a good graph indicating, it's a little bigger, kind of showing the global production of plastics from 1950, when it was initially synthesized and discovered as a use, and then to 2015, with, of course, it being 2021, and the end point of this graph being probably a bit higher. So from 0 tons to 7 billion tons, right? So what exactly are microplastics? So microplastics are defined as really tiny particles that are basically resultant from breakdown of larger plastics, or particles of plastics that are made on purpose to be super small. And we'll talk about these. These are called microbeads, right? And so usually microplastics are between 1 micrometer, which is 1/1,000,000th of a meter, really, really tiny amount, to 5 millimeters. And these are becoming much more prevalent in the environment, right? So again, as I mentioned, they're typically broken down via weathering and transformation process. So weathering, of course, is just exposure to the outside elements. Transformation process is where they'll recycle plastics and actually turn them into smaller pieces of plastic like microbeads. And so primary would be where they create these plastics as microbeads. Maybe you remember these in like certain facial cleansers, like, Dial body wash with microbeads for extra scrubbing protection. These were pretty popular in the US until 2015, until the Obama administration elected to ban them. And so we don't really see too many manufacturers overtly advertising they use them, although it's still pretty prevalent in the cosmetics industry. They just use different terms for it. And then secondarily, you see it through erosion, abrasion, photooxidation. So basically exposure to the elements, just breakdown of the products, trauma to the particular plastic product, and of course, exposure to light. And then there's another concern. So, okay, you have microplastics, which, as we mentioned, 5 micrometers, 5 millimeters, and then nanoplastics are the ones that are super small, and these are 1 to 100 nanometers in diameter, and these have the ability to enter cells, not necessarily just affect the outside membrane, enter them. So that is kind of a concern, right? And so
Yeah.
so
he does the webinar. He goes over all kinds of.
just 1 second. Sorry about that.
He's
So
gonna
coming back down.
should come in the room and watch it.
As we were talking about here,
No, nothing. I'll be in a couple minutes.
down here, the nanoplastics, okay, so as I mentioned, anywhere from 1 to nanometers in diameter, and they have the ability to enter cells, which again is a concern for a lot of us. Now, the other issue with plastics is they persist in the environment for thousands of years. So, or that's the idea. We know that plastic water bottles, disposable diapers, and certain foams can have a lifespan of 400 to 500 years in the environment. So that's, something we have to think about. And they also tend to release the additives when they're broken down. Maybe you guys have heard about BPA or phthalates. These are actually additives that have been linked to cancer. Same thing is true for PVDs. Okay, so we talked about what these microplastics are. We talked about how prevalent they are. We talked about some of the how they're made, how they have additives, and then the prevalence, right? As I mentioned, they're found all over: surface water, sediment. This is actually an interesting picture from the NIH. Let me see if I can pull this up. So this was actually created from a canyon in Spain, right? And they found that, in fact, a lot of archaeologists are thinking, 500 or 1,000 years from now, these future archaeologists will be able to determine our time period by looking for these plastic sediments within the fossil record, right? Because you can kind of tell when microplastics occurred, and you can kind of see this in this canyon. When it flooded, this a portion of microplastics actually came across and deposited in the sediment here. So they'll be like, oh, well, this is when, or from this period to this period is when these individuals were using plastics. So they're all around. Okay, so why is this important? All right, they're everywhere. They're utilized all the time. I mean, they're kind of small. What's the big deal? Multiple studies have shown that microplastics have health risks. The main issue is they seem to, one, disrupt lipid metabolism and adipogenesis. So in other words, they tend to decrease usage, they decrease fatty acid oxidation, and they are linked to obesity. In fact, that may be one of the reasons why the obesity epidemic is becoming worse and worse in the US. They cause a lot of oxidative stress. So what does that mean? So basically, when they attack, they basically act as molecules with unpaired electrons, which can disrupt cellular membranes, right? And here is an article right here that talked about some of the cytotoxic effects of nanomaterials and microplastics on cells, right? And this is just to determine the mechanism of action, and it looked at that. It was just oxidative damage. What they did was they grew 2 cell lines and exposed them to polyethylene and polystyrene. Remember those being the 2 major plastics, and they found that oxidative damage is the major way in which these 2 chemicals hurt those cell tissue buds. And then there has been evidence that it can cause DNA damage, neurotoxicity, and gut dysbiosis. So what is gut dysbiosis? That just refers to changing up the bacteria within the gut. And this particular article actually looked at some of the changes in rodents, rabbits, and chickens that were exposed to microplastics and nanoplastics. And they accumulated in certain organs, gut dysbiosis, decreased mucus secretion, metabolic alterations, neurotoxicity. Okay, so not great things found in animals as well as cell lines, but what about in humans? Well, fertility is where we're really concerned about microplastics having an effect, right? And so we do know already that BPA has an effect on reproduction. And so this particular article was published in 2020 and actually looked at how BPA apparently was linked to prostate cancer and also can cause hormonal alterations of male reproductive organs. In addition, this particular article here, which is kind of concerning, really concerning, is it actually came out in 2020. There, you see the researchers were able to get the first evidence of microplastics in human placenta, right? So the likelihood is these things are traveling, they're they're all over the place, and they're likely affecting us at all age ranges, even before we're born, right? So just kind of a concerning thought, right? And again, just as a summary, you use plastic products, they break down to micro and nanoplastics, they go to mammalian cells, right? Which then, of course, express membrane damage, oxidative stress, which then leads to lots of other systemic issues, right? Okay, so we know what they can do. They're prevalent everywhere. Everyone's using plastics. So how can we make things better, right? Well, we can make things better by primarily avoiding exposure, right? The main way in which we're exposed to many of these microplastics and nanoplastics is through oral ingestion, inhalation, through exposure to skin, and then parenteral. And parenteral, it really just means outside of the oral mucosa and GI tract, all right? So your stomach and intestines and so on. So it's outside of that. And so the idea is you want to avoid things that are gonna, I mean, inhalation is a little bit difficult to avoid because unfortunately there are plastics everywhere, but the main way in which I would try to prevent exposure is through the oral tract, oral ingestion, right? And the best way to do it would be by avoiding bottled water, right? It's something that we all are very all used to doing, right? But it seems that there's a fair amount of microplastics along with these chemicals called polyfluoroalkylated substances, which are even more, these definitely are associated with cancer, and they tend to have a high concentration in all types of bottled water plastic containers. So what I would suggest is put filters on your tap water, if at all possible, and try to use stainless steel bottles instead of like typical plastic bottles, like the Nalgene bottles being very popular. I've just resorted to glass or steel if you can. Avoid disposable cups, especially for hot liquids. It seems that when you heat up these plastics, more of the microplastics and nanoplastic particles dissolve in your solution, right? And so, and something to be aware of is paper cups tend to have a polyethylene inner lining, right? So you may think you're safe with paper, but you're actually not. You definitely don't use styrofoam. Again, as I mentioned, glass and metal containers are best for storage versus plastic containers. Never heat food in plastic containers, particularly in the microwave, right? And avoid using the dishwasher for any plastic containers if you choose to use them, right? Microwaving with plastic and styrofoam is a bad idea. So again, there's been a couple of studies that have looked at the potential migration of volatile compounds from plastic containers, microwave ovens, and it's definitely been shown to occur. So, you know, not to cause undue concern, but it's just something that I was a little skeptical about, but after doing some research, I've definitely made some changes myself, and I've resorted to using glass drinking bottles and steel drinking bottles, and probably not using nearly as much Ziploc containers as I did in the past.